Hi, my name is Michael Ox, and it is a joy to be able to share this time together as we think about reaching university students. I'm based in a place called Leicester in the middle of England, and I work not only here in the UK, but in other parts of Europe as well as the field director for a network called Foyer. Foyer is the German word for fire, and it stands for the Fellowship of Evangelists in the Universities of Europe. It was given birth about 13 years ago, and it's been really exciting to see how it has encouraged, in particular, the public proclamation of the gospel in universities across Europe. And we'll think a little bit more about that later. But I count it a real privilege and a tremendous joy to be involved in reaching university students. Reaching university students is one of the most strategic forms of ministry that we can be involved in. Think of it, university students have their lives ahead of them. So if we can bring a student to Christ, then they might have decades to be able to live for Christ and to reach others. What a joy to be able to reach people at such a strategic and influential point in their lives. I think of my own father, who became a Christian at university through the ministry of a local Christian student group. Just think of the impact that his life has had, and now on into the next generation and so on. So it's really strategic reaching university students. And many university students may end up in positions of influence and significance in our world. So if we can shape them and win them for Christ while they're at university, just think of the influence that they might have in government, in media, in the arts, and so on. One of the first university students I ever worked with was the president of the Christian Union in Bournemouth University in the south of England, where I was at that stage living. We met up and did Bible studies together. And little did I know that 17 years later, he was going to become what is now a famous film director, producing films that are being distributed and seen all over the world. What a fantastic privilege we have to invest in and to reach for Christ students who will live for Christ and then make an impact in our world. But I also think it's great working with students because in my experience of evangelism throughout the age groups, it is often students who are most open to the gospel. There's several reasons for this. Firstly, university students are often away from home for the first time. So this is often the first time they've had the opportunity to think for themselves, to be able to think about what the future holds, away from the confines and the worldview of the home that they have grown up in. And it's a time when they're thinking about how they're going to live for the rest of their life, as they lay a foundation that is going to actually be upon which they build the rest of their life. It's massively significant. And university students also develop relationships with others very quickly. Normally in life, the people we live with and work with and socialize with are three separate groups of people. But for most university students, the people they live with, work with, and socialize with are the same group of people. That means that it becomes much quicker to develop deep and meaningful relationships while you are at university. I know many graduates who look back and say, if only I could go back to my time at university, I didn't realize how much of a fantastic opportunity it was to share my faith. It is so much harder now. I have the pressures of work and family and so on. Relationships are much more difficult and much slower now that I've graduated. So reaching university students is a privilege, it is strategic, and it is also a wonderfully open mission field. But how do we go about reaching university students? Well, it's my conviction that the best people to reach students are students. They are the ones who are already in the university, already in the lecture rooms, already living alongside other students who don't know Jesus. And so Foyer works in partnership with an organization called IFES, the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, and that supports student-led Christian student groups at the heart of universities all over the world. And the conviction is that students are the best place to reach students, and students therefore are the best people to lead such groups. My role and the role of many others is to support those groups in the evangelism that they are doing. This is slightly different to individual churches doing student ministry. This is all of the churches in a city supporting a combined and united witness at the heart of the university campus. And that, done well, can be far more strategic and far more powerful than individual churches trying to do their own thing. A united witness of all the Christian students on campus working together, loving each other, and reaching out together can be the most powerful form of evangelism. This is the ministry of the local churches together on the campus for the sake of the gospel. But how do student groups reach the rest of the university with the gospel? Well, we see in the book of Acts that the gospel first spread across the world in three ways. It spread through personal evangelism, the gossiping of the gospel, one-to-one evangelism, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, or Ananias and Paul, or Peter and Cornelius, or the believers who were scattered after the stoning of Stephen, who took the gospel with them all across Judea and outside the confines of Jerusalem. One-to-one evangelism. But we also see in the book of Acts, small group evangelism. Paul in the lecture hall of Tyrannus, having discussions daily, or Paul by the riverside in Philippi, talking with the women who were praying there. Small groups of people discussing, dialoguing, and debating the gospel. But of course, we also see the proclamation of the gospel, as Peter and Paul and others stand up and proclaim the gospel publicly in the marketplaces, on the Areopagus, in the synagogues, and so on. And it's my conviction and also my experience that if we want to see universities impacted with the gospel, then we need to use all three methods of evangelism. We need one-to-one, small group, and public evangelism. The mistake of some groups is to put all of their emphasis on one of those three forms of evangelism. Some groups, for instance, spend a lot of time doing personal evangelism. Others only do public evangelism, but we need all three. Personal evangelism without public evangelism will lack breadth. We may not reach many people, particularly if our group is small. But public evangelism without personal evangelism will lack depth. We need to have the follow-up, the intentional one-to-one discipleship of new believers, and so on. So let me just, for a few moments, give you some examples of how I have seen all three methods of evangelism used well on campus. So think firstly about personal evangelism, the one-to-one sharing of the gospel. A lot of the work that I'm involved in is helping to encourage and equip Christian students to feel confident in sharing their faith. To do that, they firstly need to be grounded themselves in the gospel, convinced and convicted by the truths of the gospel, the authority of God's word, and the need to share that with others. That's why at the heart of many student groups will be the regular studying the Bible, so that students are grounded in and motivated by the gospel, the love of Christ for them, the truth of the gospel. But it's also really important that we help them think about how they can communicate that, not simply with each other, those who already know Jesus, but with those who don't. And so we'll help them think about how they can reach out and start to speak about their faith confidently with their friends. Of course, as they do so, they will find that there are questions and objections that will come their way. So we want to equip students to know how they can respond to objections and questions confidently, so they can be convinced that the gospel is public truth and they don't need to be ashamed of it. Another thing we need to do almost before that is to make sure that Christians are living out their faith in the context of those who don't yet know Jesus. There is a danger that Christians going to university can be encouraged into a holy huddle, a Christian corner, where they only hang out with other Christians. But that would be a real tragic mistake. We want to encourage Christians to make the most of being involved in their university, getting to know their fellow course mates on their lecture, engaging in other social activities, sports teams, and so on, and really living alongside those who don't know Jesus. In some countries and some universities, this will happen automatically, at least in the first year of an undergraduate degree, as people are put into halls of residence alongside random other students who they can then get to know. But after that, sometimes we need to be more intentional. We need to encourage Christians to think about intentionally living with those who don't know Jesus, because often the people we live with are the people we can most easily share the gospel with. So we want to encourage people to be doing personal evangelism. But secondly, we want to encourage people to be doing small group evangelism. One of the things that we have found particularly helpful over the course of the last few years has been a resource called Uncover. Uncover was a resource which is basically the gospel, one of the gospels. They've done 3 now. We've done Uncover Mark, Uncover John, and Uncover Luke. And as well as being the text of one of the gospel accounts, it's also a series of inductive Bible studies that you could do with a friend or with a small group of people. And we have seen how this has really equipped Christian students to be able to get their friends to start studying the Bible for themselves. One of the best ways to share the gospel is through the Gospels. And so as we look at the Gospels together, Jesus can walk off the pages of Scripture. And as students see other students being confident enough to invite their friends to study the Bible with them, that encourages them to do the same. And it's been wonderful to see so many students naturally inviting their friends to study the Bible. We can treat it a bit like a book club. You could say to someone, look, Jesus, from a historical point of view, is one of the most influential figures in history. Have you ever taken the time to look at one of the first century contemporary accounts of his life? Why not look into it? It's fascinating. People don't have to be religious. They don't even have to be particularly spiritually open. We just want to whet their appetites and see if they would like to find out more. Small group Bible studies can be a really powerful way of intriguing people with the gospel, but also following up those who've been intrigued, maybe for a mission event or through something else. So we've had personal evangelism and small group evangelism. But thirdly and finally, we want to be publicly proclaiming the gospel at the heart of the university. Sometimes we might feel that if we are small, we can't do that. Many student groups across Europe are very small. I was just talking recently with the General Secretary of the Czech student movements, and recently they were involved in a public evangelistic initiative in the city of Ostrava, where there is one Christian student known to the General Secretary, and yet they were still able to do it. It's important that we proclaim the gospel publicly. And one of the ways that we have found a very helpful way of doing that over the last few years has been through what we might call a mission week, a series of public evangelistic events in or near to the heart of the university, where the gospel is explained, where people can have an opportunity to respond, and where that is done in a hospitable, warm context. It might be a cafe or a lecture room. It might be a church, but it needs to be warm and inviting. It will often be in the context of a meal or at least refreshments. And it will be where people also have the opportunity to discuss and come back on what the speaker says. Now, why do a mission week? Why have a series of public evangelistic events? Well, there are a number of reasons for that. Firstly, a mission week can provide a culmination and a focus to all the other evangelism that's being done throughout the year in that Christian student group. Knowing that you have a mission week coming, perhaps in the second term, in the spring time in the year, means that all the other things that you're doing, small groups and one-to-one, can focus towards that big event that you're wanting to bring people to. Mission weeks can also have much more of an impact than an individual one-off event. It's very easy for students to miss what is happening on campus if you just run one event. But if you run a whole week of events, it's much harder for that to happen, particularly if you publicize those events well in person and online in all sorts of different ways. Mission weeks also create momentum. You find that with experience, mission weeks normally grow in size as the weeks go on. I remember speaking in Ukraine a few years ago, and on the first day, we only had one guest come to the Mission Week event. By the end of the week, there was 100. And that almost always happens. If you run a mission well, people gain confidence in what you're doing and will want to come back and find out more. And what you'll often find is that non-Christian students are the best evangelists. They haven't heard that evangelism is meant to be scary. And it's perfectly natural for them, if they've enjoyed coming to an event, to tell other people about it and invite them along. I remember in Serbia speaking at a debate on the first night of a mission week. And the non-Christians who came actually to support the atheist who was speaking against me, so enjoyed the event, they invited their friends to come back and to hear the talks for the rest of the week. So mission weeks grow and often expand as the weeks go on. If you only had the first event, it might feel a bit disappointing, but you've got time to learn, to grow, to develop. And by the end of the week, normally most student groups will be very encouraged by what the Lord has done. Mission weeks also give people repeated opportunities to hear the gospel. A survey that was done a few years ago in the United States said that on average, it takes 32 links with the gospel for someone to come from not understanding anything about Jesus to finally becoming a Christian. 32 conversations, talks, books read, and so on. Now, there are two ways that we can respond to such a finding. Firstly, we might say it's going to take a very long time for anyone to ever become a Christian. Or we might say, if it takes so many encounters with the gospel for people to come to Christ, how can we create as many encounter opportunities as possible in a shorter space of time? And a mission week is one way that we can do that really well. I think of a guy who came to a mission not far from here in the UK called Rob. And he came because he had been befriended by students who he lived with who were Christians. And he came to every talk through the week, both lunchtime and evening. That's 10 gospel talks that he heard. And after every gospel talk, he had a conversation with me or someone else who was at the event. That's another 10 conversations, 20 conversations and talks that he has now heard. He also met up with some other people for meals through the week so he could ask them further questions. That's even more encounters with the gospel. And so it's no surprise that although Rob started the week as a skeptic who was a long way from Christ, by Friday night, he was ready to put his trust in Christ. A mission week gave him the many exposures that he needed to hear the gospel, to raise his objections, and to come to that point of putting his trust in Jesus. A mission week can do that, but without it, it might have taken years for him to hear enough to come to that particular point. But mission weeks also provide the opportunity to work with others. If you put on one evangelistic event, you may be able to invite a speaker if they're not too far away. But if you put on a mission week, you could invite a speaker from maybe even a different country. You could get a whole team of people to come and help. You could recruit the help of people from local churches. There's a way that you can build a team around a focused week of events that would be very difficult to do and hard to justify if you were just doing one event. So a mission can grow gospel unity at the heart of the university. Churches working together in partnership for the sake of the gospel. And one last thing, missions can also train and equip and disciple Christians. One of the wonderful side effects that I have often seen when I speak at a mission week is Christians who grow in their confidence in the gospel. Often that's because they're seeing the gospel publicly explained in a way that makes sense and publicly defended in a way that is reasonable and sensible. And as they see the gospel doing that, they themselves grow in confidence as a Christian. And even if they themselves haven't brought lots of people to the mission week, you normally find that if they do it again the following year, they are in a better position to seize that opportunity and to make the most of it. So how do student groups reach the university? In three ways: personal evangelism, small group evangelism, and public evangelism. And those are three ideas that I've seen used very effectively, not just here in the UK, but all over Europe and beyond. And when student groups do not just one, but all three of those things in combination, we can see a very powerful impact at the heart of the university. In some places, we've seen great fruit as numbers of students have come to faith in Jesus. In other parts of Europe, where the ground is harder, we may not see as much response, although wonderfully, even in these places, we are seeing people trust Christ, even if the numbers are not great. But also we need to remember that we reach people with the gospel, not just because we see that it works, but because it's biblical. We are called to proclaim the gospel publicly, in small groups, and personally. And reaching students will be one of the most strategic parts of society that we can reach. Well, There's so much more we could say about this, but for now, that's all I'm going to share, because in a moment, we'll have a time to discuss these things, to share from our experience and to ask questions. So we really look forward to that time together. And I really look forward to meeting a number of you shortly. Thank you so much.